thank you for coming back for our fourth day. We have been describing a new sort of model of the universe, a new way of thinking about creation, centered on this idea of a circle of creation and this idea of endless waking up, this idea of an eternal drive towards self-consciousness, which is the same as the consciousness of the divine. To use the traditional theological language, God created the world so that he could be known and loved. We can say that we've been taking that simple statement that we're long familiar with in our writings and translating it into the language of consciousness and this metaphor of the circle of creation, of arcs of descent and of ascent. And I'll just throw this out there, but in the realm of hardcore physics and quantum mechanics, the state of a system exists in a kind of, before it's observed, it exists in a state of potential, and it requires an active observation to resolve that state of potentiality, let's say, into a state of actuality. What observes the universe? If something needs to be observed to be sort of resolved into actuality. One of the great physicists of the last century, John Wheeler, had an idea that, and I believe this is a quote, that the universe may have come into existence quantum mechanically by a recursive act of self-observation. What he summarized pithily in the phrase it from bit, which requires more explanation than I want to take. But if you're interested in that idea, there's you can Google it probably and find an interesting diagram. But the idea that even from the domain of science and cosmology, the same sort of idea has cropped up, that perhaps the universe in a way creates itself through an act of self-observation, is not that different, I submit, from the theological conception that God loved the world and so he created the world to be known and loved. One sees a kind of repetition of an idea of this recursive circle, which by the way is one of the more ancient symbols that have come down to us from various societies. The symbol of the snake swallowing its tail, the Ouroboros, which is one of the that's another, I think, alleyway that we won't go down. But it's so interesting how these big ideas end up cropping up in different ways in very different domains. But all of this is a very cosmic way of looking at things. It's, in a way, a very impersonal way of looking at things. And what I wanted to do today and tomorrow is translate all of this very cosmological, metaphysical positioning of things into the realm of the here and now. Today, I want to talk about personal dimensions of the circle of existence, personal dimensions of spirituality and of spiritual transformation. And tomorrow I'll talk about collective dimensions of spirituality. So I'm saving some of the very pressing topics of the day, like social justice and institutional racism and so forth, for tomorrow. And today we'll be looking at the question of spirit and spiritual progress from the perspective of an individual. Of course, as individuals, we occupy only one particular moment, one particular point on this arc on the circle of creation, although it may be a special point in a way, being the opposite to the divine center, as Abdu'l-Baha says. And we can't we obviously can't step into the consciousness of any other point along this circle of existence. We can't know what it is to be a rock or a plant. We don't know what it's like to be a bat. So we start with human consciousness, and what I wanted to do is, and there's obviously so much written on this in the Baha'i writings, and in so many different ways. And so what I'll be doing is just an attempt to pull together some of the main topics and in individual personal spirituality, and try to relate them to this narrative of the circle of existence and the story of unfolding consciousness as I presented it over the last few days. The first point to make is a point about when we talk about the human reality, what are we talking about? The language and the terminology that is sometimes used in not just in the Baha'i writings, but in all of the religious traditions can sometimes perhaps be confusing, because we have so many different words for aspects of human spiritual reality. We have the word spirit and we have the word soul, just for starters. Is there a difference between spirit and soul? That's important, you know. If we don't understand the difference between them, we won't understand something essential about spirituality. What if we throw in the word mind? What's the relationship between mind and spirit and soul? And then what if we throw in the word heart? The word heart is often, what about inner being? There's so many different words for what might seem like, different aspects or appendages of the human reality. And I wanted just to begin with a simplifying statement. And this simplifying statement comes from Baha'u'llah, who assures us, this is in Summons of the Lord of Hosts, the second tablet, the 35th paragraph. He says, spirit, mind, soul, and the powers of sight and hearing are but one single reality, which hath manifold expressions owing to the diversity of its instruments. I'll try to be a little more present, and when I give a quotation, I will paste it into the chat. And sometimes the quotation will include transliterations of the original terms. So there's a nice simplification we can make, that there really is only one reality. Sometimes we talk about it as spirit, sometimes we use the word mind, sometimes we use the word soul or heart, but let's not confuse the issue or muddy the waters too much by imagining that this is some complicated thing. It's a very simple thing. But however simple it is, it's also completely unknowable. And this we're assured again in a number of passages in the Baha'i writings. And as I'm speaking from, oftentimes I'm pulling these passages from my compilation on the Loom of Reality. And in this case, I'll post the link to that compilation as I'm speaking, and you can, if you want to open a window and read along. I'm picking through some quotations here. There are a number of passages stating this absolute incomprehensibility of the human soul. Baha'u'llah in Gleaning says, "Wert thou to ponder in thy heart from now to the end that hath no end, this sign of the revelation of the all-abiding, all-glorious God, thou wilt fail to comprehend its mystery or to appraise its virtue." Also in Gleanings, Baha'u'llah seems to hold up this ineffable mystery of the human soul alongside the mystery of the reality of God, as being these two great mysteries that ultimately we will ever be powerless to comprehend. He says, "Having recognized thy powerless to attain unto an adequate understanding of that reality which abideth within thee, thou wilt readily admit the futility of such efforts to fathom the mystery of the living God. This confession of helplessness, which mature contemplation must eventually impel every mind to make, is itself the acme of human understanding and marketh the culmination of man's development. So it's almost as if the best we can do is at some point throw up our hands and say, we're not going to get any farther. But let's press onward despite the assurance that we're not going to reach the heart of the matter. And knowing that what we will reach, if not the heart of the matter, if not anywhere close to the reality of things, will hopefully reach to a useful map, a useful approximation, like the subway map we talked about a few days ago, that although we won't be under any illusions that we're talking about the essence of the thing, we will hopefully at least be able to describe it in a way that's helpful, describe it in a way that allows us to navigate human life better, to navigate human relationships better. Hopefully we can find a framework for understanding the human soul, which is not intrinsically exclusive, which doesn't, for example, divide the human race into believers and non-believers, into those who know and to those who don't. That's, I think, one of the unfortunate heritage, among the unfortunate heritage of spiritual belief, is that in some ways the belief that, and it's a wonderful thing, of course, having a born again experience, having such an experience of transformation that one feels that one has made a passage from one state of being to another, and this is a reality. But if that becomes a further way to divide people into a community of the saved and a benighted community of those who are not saved, then has this spiritual understanding ultimately led to an improvement in the affairs of humanity or not? So, given that the essential nature of the soul is an enigma, it can be never understood in its totality, we nevertheless have in the Baha'i writings a number of, let's say, helpful metaphors for understanding what kind of a reality it is. And among those is an idea that is familiar to those in the, certainly those who have studied Neoplatonism, I suppose a shrinking population these days, but those, anyone who has had any contact with the Islamic spiritual and mystical tradition, and this is an idea of emanation, which is really a metaphor like all others, a map to try to understand an ineffable reality. But one finds quite in a great abundance the concept of emanation and the concept of the human spirit in all its unknowability as standing in the position of emanation. Abdu'l-Baha puts it this way. He says, the reality of man is a pure and unknown essence constituting a depository emanating from the light of the ancient entity, God. This essence or soul of man, because of its innate purity and its connection with the unseen ancient entity, is old as regards time, but new as regards individuality. There's a lot that one could unpack from that quotation, but we have so many to go over that I'm not going to be able to pause on any one for any length of time. Also, Abdu'l-Baha says in his tablet to Dr. Farrell that the merciful outpourings of that divine essence, however, are vouchsafed unto all beings, and it is incumbent upon man to ponder in his heart upon the effusions of the divine grace, the soul being counted as one, rather than upon the divine essence. And there are many others. Perhaps I should have read, first of all, Abdu'l-Baha's statement in Some Answered Questions in chapter 54, which we can take as a real locus classicus, a kind of ground zero for the Baha'i doctrine of the spirit, if one could say that we have one. Abdu'l-Baha says, the spirit of men proceed from God by emanation, in the same way as the discourse proceeds from the speaker and the writing from the writer. That is, the speaker himself does not become the speech any more than the writer becomes the writing. The connection is rather one of emanational procession, for the speaker remains in an absolute state of ability and power as the discourse emanates from him, even as the action emanates from his author. He goes on to say that the procession of human spirits from God is therefore an emanational procession. This is one of the chapters of Some Answered Questions, and I'm reading from the retranslated version, where it really does help to look at if you're reading it in English, it really does help to read the retranslation, because it's translated a lot more precisely, with closer attention to the underlying technical terminology than the original translation, which was a century old, by Laura Clifford Barney. Abdu'l-Baha in this chapter of Some Answered Questions is deep into technical terminology, and the translation is very meticulous in maintaining the faithfulness of that terminology in equivalent terms in the English. And emanational procession is one of those technical terms, and that's how Abdu'l-Baha describes this, what the human spirit is. Again, not knowing really what it is in essence, what we can say is it exists as a sort of an emanation. And this is a helpful picture of human reality as it relates to the circle of existence, because the circle of existence is a circle of emanation. It is the emanation of light, which comprises the arc of descent as well as the arc of ascent. But as every metaphor and every concrete picture of this ultimately breaks down, the imagery of emanation, like rays shining from the sun, also breaks down quite clearly, because the rays of the sun never bend around and come back to the sun. So when one looks at the astrophysical reality of shining stars, it doesn't exactly resemble the circle of existence. And so one has to accept the limitations of these metaphors. Perhaps it's a bit more like a magnetic field lines, because the magnetic field lines do, in a way, emanate out from the magnet and then return back. They curve back and return to the magnet. So perhaps the metaphor of magnetism is even better in this sense. And magnetism, of course, also you get the bonus that in a magnet you also have embodied this idea of attraction, which is the force of love, which is the whole motive force of the circle of existence. A second major metaphor for the reality of the human soul, apart from this metaphor of emanation, is the metaphor of the mirror. And we're probably familiar with that if we have any passing familiarity with the Baha'i writings. And I just dropped the link to several dozen quotations, again, mainly from the Baha'i writings, that give sort of further delineation to this idea of the soul as mirror, as the human reality as a kind of a mirror for the divine reflection. And again, because of the quantity of material that we have to go through, I won't dwell on this, but just having dropped the link there, if you're interested in your own time, you can find this really amazingly rich explication of this concept by I think all of the central figures of the faith, and even in letters of the Guardian. The third metaphor for the human reality. So it's nice that despite the fact that we're assured that we're never going to understand it, we nevertheless have a lot of sort of supporting narratives to help us try to imagine what that thing is that constitutes our essence. A third is this idea of there being like a spark or a flame within the soul. This we're familiar with from, and I'll post a link to that again, with many dozens of passages giving that concept of, And I suppose if I was being even more present, I would tag this in the chat window so you know what these, what each of these quote blocks are for. But when you click through, you'll see. The idea of the art essential reality being a kind of divine spark that's within us is perhaps most commonly seen, universally seen in the hidden words of Baha'u'llah, including statements such as "Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee. My love is in thee, know it, that thou mayest find me near unto thee. With the hands of power I made thee, and with the fingers of strength I created thee, and within thee have I placed the essence of my light. Ye are my treasury, for in you I have treasured the pearls of my mysteries and the gems of my knowledge." So over and over in the hidden words, we have this idea of the immanence of the divine, the idea which is really contrasting, although not contradicting. It's like two poles of a sphere. It's contrasting the idea of God as transcendent, which is perhaps more the mode that we see the divine described in the standard sacred texts of the Western tradition, in the Old and New Testament, in the Quran. It's very much, almost overwhelmingly, or almost exclusively in the mode of God as transcendent entity. You do find, however, also in the New Testament, in some of the words of Jesus, more of the immanent character of God, where, for example, Jesus says God is love. That's something which proceeds from the heart. He says the kingdom of God is within you. That I think is resonates well with these various statements in the writings about this divine light or love being deposited within us. When we turn from the idea of trying to get at some helpful metaphor for what our essential spiritual nature is, to helpful metaphors of how that essential nature expresses itself in motion. In other words, we're talking about the process of spiritual development or transformation as distinct from trying to get at the nature of the soul sort of as a static object, looking at it and trying to imagine what it is and what its relationship to God is. It seems that, again, here we have, if I could make the claim, perhaps two dominant narratives about the nature of spiritual development and spiritual transformation. And I've sort of given it away just by those two phrases. We have a narrative of spiritual development, and we have a narrative of spiritual transformation. We have, and let me take the second of these first, and relate them both and hopefully resolve the two of them if there ever was in our minds a sense of tension, which there has been in my own mind at times when I think about it and try to understand it. But to try to relate both of these narrative frameworks of spiritual progress within the overarching framework of the circle of existence. The second of these that I just mentioned, the idea of spiritual transformation, the idea that there is some moment in the life of a person when their spiritual outlook is transformed, a moment which is almost described as a kind of a binary thing. You were a 0 and now you're a 1. You were in a state of unbelief and now you're a state of belief. You were born to the world of matter and you were born again into the realm of the spirit. This language of spirit, which as I intimated before, in its perhaps darkest manifestations can, and I don't even want to say, I'm saying darkest manifestations, it says this is a bad thing. I mean, it's a wonderful thing being born again, but one can take that and make it a source of division, make it a source of, I know and you don't. My community is the community of the saved and your community is not. But stepping back from that to the intrinsic goodness of this, one finds in the Baha'i writing so many passages again on this process of transformation and the entrance into the city of certitude, as Baha'u'llah describes it in the Kitab-i-Iqan. And let me again paste into the chat window some quotations on that, and there are many hundreds, I think. Again, with many different kinds of imagery that's used to describe the transformation, the idea of spiritual baptism, the idea of spiritual rebirth, the idea of transmutation by the divine elixir, that changes the copper of the soul, the base metal of the soul, into gold. All of this imagery helps to establish an idea of spiritual transformation as being a one-off event. It's like once you've been born again, you're never unborn. It's once you've entered that realm of faith, you're now you've almost ascended to a different level of being. I think of this when of this sort of mode of the idea of spiritual progress when I read the Kitab-i-Iqan, part 2 of the Book of Certitude, where Baha'u'llah describes, after laying out for us all of the prerequisites of the true seeker in their search for spiritual reality, when he describes this entrance into the city, you have this sense of sudden transformation. He says, at that hour, this is paragraph 216 in the Book of Certitude. He says, at that hour will the mystic herald, bearing the joyful tidings of the Spirit, shine forth from the city of God, resplendent as the morn, and through the trumpet blast of knowledge will awaken the heart, the soul, and the spirit from the slumber of negligence. Then will the manifold favors and outpouring grace of the holy and everlasting Spirit confer such new life upon the seeker that he will find himself endowed with a new eye, a new ear, a new heart, and a new mind. He will contemplate the manifest signs of the universe and will penetrate the hidden mysteries of the soul. Gazing with the eye of God, he will perceive within every atom a door that leadeth him to the stations of absolute certitude. He will discover in all things the mysteries of divine revelation and the evidences of an everlasting manifestation. And Abdu'l-Baha also describes in similarly ecstatic terms this passage of the soul, this momentary passage of the soul into the state of faith using the imagery of baptism. And this is from, let me actually paste the quote that I just read, and then paste the quote that we'll be reading next. Sorry if I'm being inconsistent here. This is from the Promulgation of Universal Peace. Abdu'l-Baha says, if he is baptized with the Holy Spirit, if he is freed from the bondage of nature, released from animalistic tendencies, and advanced in the human realm, he is fitted to enter into the divine kingdom. The world of the kingdom is the realm of divine bestowals and the bounties of God. It is attainment to the highest virtues of humanity. It is nearness to God. It is capacity to receive the bounties of the ancient Lord. When man advances to this station, he attains the second birth. If he attains to rebirth while in the world of nature, he will become informed of the divine world. He will observe that another and a higher world exists. Wonderful bounties descend. Eternal life awaits. Everlasting glory surrounds him. All the signs of reality and greatness are there. He will see the lights of God. All these experiences will be his when he is born out of the world of nature into the world divine. Therefore, for the perfect man, there are two kinds of birth. The first, physical birth, is from the matrix of the mother. The second, or spiritual birth, is from the world of nature. And if you follow the link, you'll find there's just innumerable passages on this theme. So, and I will be comparing this to a second narrative or set of narratives about the nature of spiritual progress, which instead of being a sort of instantaneous phenomenon, is a continuous phenomenon. Instead of being discontinuous, it's like there's a passage, the trumpet sounds and now you're awakened. There's another way of thinking about spiritual progress, which is it's a day-by-day grind. It's a daily act, daily acts that gradually build one's spiritual virtues. I've often wondered about this and wondered, well, is one of these, which of these applies in my life? Or is there sort of one way to understand this that, is it maybe it's one at certain times in one's life and it's another way in, during the rest of one's life? One way I think to think about this in terms of the metaphor of the circle of creation is that just as with the idea of dualism versus monism, one gets both of those out of the circle of creation. You get dualism out of the circle of creation because one is always situated somewhere along the arc of descent or somewhere along the arc of ascent. And being situated somewhere along the arc of descent, there are always two directions that one could travel, or that one could orient oneself. One can orient oneself backwards along the arc of descent, or one can orient oneself forwards along the arc of ascent. This is one way, and this not only explains how one can think in a metaphysically dualistic way, and how metaphysical dualism is, let's say, true within that perspective, but one also understands that if one abstracts oneself outside of that circle of existence, one sees that there's really only one circle. So you're back to a kind of monistic way of thinking. And then you see the whole circle and all the stages of the circle, and you understand it from that perspective. Perhaps individual spiritual development can also be thought of in a similar sense. One is always situated somewhere in the spectrum of spiritual progress, in the spectrum of the unfolding advance of consciousness. But one is always, wherever one is situated, there's always two directions that one could fundamentally be oriented with respect to. And the first direction is that of the physical world, back along the arc of descent from which you came. And the second possible spiritual direction is forwards along the ascending arc and ascending degrees of spiritual realization. And perhaps it's in that sense that the Baha'i writings speak of there being a dual nature to the human reality. And again, this is a topic in which there is quite a large literature, and I just posted the link to that in the chat window. And this is perhaps it's helpful to think about this idea of there being a higher and a lower nature within man, an animalistic nature and a spiritual nature and so forth. It's helpful to think about that in terms of the circle of existence, because it doesn't require us to turn our reality, it doesn't require us to divide ourselves into two different people. There's the animal me and then there's the spiritual me. Instead, the two different natures of humanity become two different orientations. When we talk about our lower nature, we talk about orienting our consciousness along the arc of descent. And when we talk about the spiritual nature, it's orienting it in the opposite direction. So that's one way that we can use this metaphor, perhaps to helpfully understand, and then to understand the simultaneous truth of people who talk about there really being only one spiritual reality, there's only one human reality, and other people who say, well, actually there's a higher and a lower nature. You can say, yeah, well, they're both true, and you can understand precisely how they can both be true within their own sphere. So moving from this first set of metaphors about spirituality, which is kind of a dualistic, within this realm of dualism, we can then proceed to the second set of metaphors, which sees spiritual advancement in more gradual in stages as opposed to just a binary belief, disbelief kind of narrative. And I would say gradual, but there appears to be, degrees, even in this perspective, the degrees may be infinite, but it seems as though there are still, stages in the opening of consciousness, even when one is orienting along the arc of ascent and thinking about spirituality as a, as a matter of continual progress. Of course, the principal sources for this kind of discussion of spirituality are for Baha'is, are Baha'u'llah's mystical tablets that were revealed in Baghdad, the 7 valleys, the 4 valleys, and quite significantly for those who are interested in really trying to dissect the nature of the valleys and try to pull together the different ways that spiritual degrees have been discussed. This new volume, The Call of the Divine Beloved, published just a few years ago, which includes not only retranslations of the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys, but also a number of shorter but very relevant and very important mystical tablets that help to add, I think, immensely to the subtlety of our understanding of this topic. I say subtle because there is I believe one can take the 7 valleys, the 4 valleys, the Gems of Divine Mysteries, I should mention, which was not included in Call of the Divine Beloved. It still exists as a separate volume. For now, I imagine at some point they could all be brought together. But Gems of Divine Mysteries also presents in part a series of, or sequence of spiritual stages very similar to the 7 valleys, but different in some key aspects. The 7 valleys, as we may know, Baha'u'llah's greatest mystical composition, is patterned in part upon a much earlier mystical text called the Conference of the Birds, which many centuries before was written as a parable of the journey of a group of birds, 30 birds, in Persian, si morg, on traversing various valleys of understanding in their journey to meet and attain the presence of the great bird whose name was si morg, which kind of gives away the end and the beginning, because the si morg, which is the end of their journey, ended up being the reality which was in their own selves. The 30 birds attained at the end of the journey the divine light that was shining within. As Baha'u'llah describes these valleys, and it's very difficult, it's impossible to do any justice to what Baha'u'llah has done in these various mystical works in just a few minutes. But I wanted to suggest that there is a way of understanding the overall progression of stages within these different mystical works. That there is, because they're described sometimes in different order, they're described using different language. One wonders if there's what's the overall picture that emerges from this. And what I wanted to suggest is that Baha'u'llah seems to be describing degrees in the expansion of consciousness, going back to the overarching theme of this entire sequence of talks, which is impelling the development of consciousness. I believe that what Baha'u'llah is describing in these mystical tablets represents stages in the expansion of human consciousness. And it begins with a state of consciousness which is fundamentally restricted and inwardly directed, not inwardly in the sense of towards the light of the divine, but inwardly towards the lower self. Fundamentally oriented along the arc of descent, if you will. and that what Baha'u'llah describes is a series of openings of the human consciousness, which gradually ends in the complete opening of the consciousness to a full embrace of the other. So the seven valleys and the four valleys, gems of divine mysteries, and these other mystical tablets in Call of the Divine Beloved. There's actually a course that I gave on this last year, and it took about 10 sessions to get through them. And I'll try, so I can't compress that in a few minutes. But what I wanted to suggest is that the human consciousness begins in the first valley in a state of heedlessness. I mean, this could be valley 0, actually. The state of heedlessness. The first valley is when the state of search is activated. But in the beginning, the human soul, being fundamentally oriented along the arc of descent, sees the world as divided into selves, and others. It sees the world fundamentally through what Baha'u'llah calls the eye of distinction, which is not wrong within these early stages in the spiritual path. One naturally differentiates between one thing and the next. In the context of religious history, one differentiates between one religion and another religion. One looks at the messages and says these are incompatible. One looks at others and say this person is not of my tribe. You know, it looks at the world as basically divided into lots of different things. As one ascends through the various valleys, and these things that one is in relation to, that one is in tension with these things. You know, there's a tension between this religion and that religion, between this message and that message. Baha'u'llah describes in the seven valleys a series of openings of consciousness, which ultimately resolves and dissolves these tensions. And the first resolution of the tension happens in the valley of knowledge, which is the third valley, but which is still a valley of limitation, in which he says the valleys, the tension between the opposites is resolved in that third valley. This is a paragraph. This is in paragraph 24 of the seven valleys. That the wayfarer in this valley seeth in God's creation neither contradiction nor incongruity. There's a resolution of opposites. But as one proceeds to the valleys beyond that, and there's almost a fundamental division between the first three valleys and the last four valleys in Baha'u'llah's seven valleys. Beginning with the fourth valley, one enters into a very different kind of orientation. You know, the fourth valley is almost represents this reorientation of the soul from the arc of descent, seeing through the eye of distinction, and starting to see through the eye of oneness. And I think a key paragraph to understand these sort of gradual openings of consciousness and awareness of levels of unity is in paragraph 30 of the seven valleys, where Baha'u'llah is describing the valleys before. He says, such as the state of the wayfarers in this valley. And he's here talking about earlier valleys. He says, but the people of the valleys above this see the end and the beginning as one. Nay, they see neither beginning nor end, and witness neither first nor last. Nay, rather, the denizens of the city of immortality who dwell in the celestial garden see not even neither first nor last. They fly from all that is first and repulse all that is last. I mean, it's a little bit difficult to parse, but the way I read this is that Baha'u'llah seems to be describing a state in which there's an initial understanding or resolution of opposites and resolution of tensions when one starts seeing with the eye of unity, in which one realizes, oh, this is the same as that. this prophet is fundamentally one with that prophet. I'm fundamentally one with you, my brother, my sister. And that's the first stage of unity. But there are stages of unity beyond that. And this is, I think, one of the more significant corrections that was made to the translation of the Seven Valleys. And that is that when the seeker enters the Valley of Unity, the Valley of Unity is not just valley number 4 in the Seven Valleys. And this is in paragraph 35. A better translation is, the wayfarer cometh to the first station of unity, which means that the valleys beyond the 4th valley, contentment, wonderment, true poverty, and absolute nothingness, are further stages or further stations of unity. So we have then the 7 valleys dividing fundamentally into 3 stations, 3 valleys and 4 valleys. The 3 initial valleys are stages of distinction, and the 4 valleys that follow are various stages in one's understanding of the concept of unity. And these understandings of the concept of unity begin in a sort of more, in a simpler and less subtle sense of just understanding that the end and the beginning are one. But then, as Baha'u'llah says in this paragraph, later on, he flies from all that is first and repulses all that is last. He rejects even the idea of ends and beginnings, which is to say, it's a higher degree of unity to even drop the notion of this and that. It's a lower degree of unity to say this and that are one and the same. But higher still is to see with such an eye of unity that there no longer is a this and a that. There no longer is a me and a you. All of the ego boundaries drop away, and the soul finds itself for the first time experiencing itself through the eye of God. This is the station of fana. This is the furthermost station, at least of the 7 valleys, in which, because the ego boundaries have dropped away, it's described as annihilation. It's described as non-existence. Not because the seeker has ceased to exist, but because with all of the ego boundaries dropped, there no longer remains any distinction between the soul of the seeker and the soul of the universe, which is the ocean of the primal will. Abdu'l-Baha puts it, I think he's saying something along these lines in Selections of the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, and I just popped this into the chat window. He says, release yourselves from this world's life, and at every stage long ye for non-existence. For when the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out, and when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the true lover findeth his beloved, he yieldeth up his soul. And there's another beautiful passage, and I think this is in the 4 valleys, and it's really quite, I think quite helpful, if I can find it. It's about the lover being encumbered by his shirt. If anyone knows that one. It's not coming up. You'll find it somewhere in the 7 valleys. Baha'u'llah says that he basically gives the metaphor of the lover and the beloved, and he says that the lover cannot truly come nigh unto the beloved if he is encumbered by his shirt. And in the original translation of the 7 valleys, it didn't really come through because it also implies physical union. It's one of the ways in many sort of cases in which spiritual transcendence is related to the metaphor of human love, and even human sexual love sometimes. And so this is really gutted here that I'm not finding it. but you look for the phrase encumbered by his shirt. The idea is that unless the seeker removes his shirt, he can't fully merge with the reality of the beloved. The two cannot become one as long as there's any impediment between the lover and the beloved, between the seeker and the object of the search. And that impediment is the ego. You know, the shirt is representative of that ego boundary that has to be dropped away. So all these various stages seem to be in a way completely incommensurate with each other. I mean, to see through the eye of distinction and to see through the eye of unity, how can two people even have a conversation when one is fundamentally looking through the lens of me and you, through the lens of othering people, whereas another person may look through a lens of unity. Baha'u'llah seems to validate all of these stages simultaneously. He's not saying that one is true and one is false, but he recognizes that it is a condition of the world that there will always be seekers at along these different stages in the spiritual quest. And that even though this leads to tensions between some seekers and other seekers, and in Gems of Divine Mysteries, Baha'u'llah says, as I think I mentioned a couple of days ago, that those in one stage of the journey regard those in another stage of the journey as blasphemers or unbelievers. In Gems of Divine Mysteries, this is, I think I have the paragraph here that I can stick in the chat window. He says, in this stage, which marketh the beginning of the journey, thou shalt behold diverse stations and differing signs, even as was mentioned in the connection with the city of search. All these hold true in their respective planes. It behooveth thine eminence to this, in this station, to consider each created thing in its own place, neither abasing nor exalting its true rank. For instance, if thou wert to reduce the unseen world to the realm of creation, this would be an act of sheer blasphemy, and the converse would likewise be the essence of impiety. Wert thou, however, to describe the unseen world in the realm of creation within their own stations, this would be the undoubted truth. Comprehend in like manner every station, sign, and illusion, that thou mayest perceive all things in their own place and consider all matters in their proper light. This is, I think, an extension of the idea of the four schools of thought that we brought up a few days ago, that Baha'u'llah takes these contradictory ways of looking at the universe and says there's a way of justifying each of these. And also, I think it links to the passage from Call of the Divine Beloved, tablet number 6, that I also read a couple of days ago, and I won't reread, about the irreducibility of there being these different spiritual perspectives. Through the metaphor of the circle of existence, one can see that every stage in this circle is populated. Every stage in the circle is limited in relation to the stage behind it, ahead of it, and is advanced in relation to the stage behind it. But all of them are on the journey, and all of them see and have access to certain truths that are valid within that stage. At the highest stage, when all of the ego boundaries fall away, when one reaches the station of evanescence, the Bab describes I think this stage in a particular way, which is very challenging, but at the same time, I think very helpful for our understanding of these things. And I put that also in the chat window. This is provisionally translated by Nader Saidi in Gate of the Heart. What the Bab, I believe, is doing here is connecting this idea of God's love for his own essence, which is the originating point of creation and is the source of this metaphor of the circle of existence. Baha'u'llah is, the Bab is calling this the divine self-remembrance, the divine self-description. He says it's God remembering himself to himself. Abdu'l-Baha would call this the first of the 4 stages of love. And what the Bab says in this passage, very, very challengingly, I think, is that he relates this divine self-description to the soul. And he basically says that's what the soul ultimately is a mode of this divine self-description. Let's read the passage. It really requires multiple readings, but I'll read it once and then just leave it here in the chat window for you to contemplate later on. He says, therefore it is necessary, according to true wisdom, that the pre-existent God describe himself to his creatures, that they may recognize their creator, and that out of the grace of the pre-existent, the contingent beings may attain their supreme end. This divine self-description is itself a created thing. It is unlike any other description, the sign of he is the one who hath no equal, and the truth of the servant, his true being. Whoso hath recognized it, hath recognized his Lord. This description, the divine self-description, is denoted as the soul or self. And he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. At other times it is expressed as the heart, which is a description of the divinity by the divinity, and as the essence of servitude. It is the sign of God shown by him in the world and within the souls of men, that it may be revealed unto them that verily he is the truth. Behold with the eye of thy heart, verily thy truth, the truth of thy being, is the divinity of thy Lord, revealed unto thee and through thee. Thou art he himself, and he is thou thyself, except that indeed thou art that thou art, and he is that he is. There's a huge amount to unpack from this quotation, but I relate it to the concept of the circle of existence. It seems to me to merge perfectly with this metaphor of the circle of existence, that the ultimate reality of the soul, once all of the shirt of the lover is stripped away, and one attains to the realization that one's consciousness is like a wave on the sea of the will, which we talked about, I think, a couple of days ago. The sea hath ever been the sea, and all contingent things, its waves and forms. When we realize that divine spark shining within us, to mix the metaphor, is this fragment of the will, is our ultimate reality is not separate from the reality of the divine self-description. We are all fragments of the divine seeking to know itself. When we understand that, we understand that our truth is the divinity of God revealed unto us and through us, and that there is no. We're talking now about this highest state of mystic realization, perhaps attained by very few people throughout history. I mean, if it's hard for us to conceive of this, it may be because it's describing a state that very few people have attained, and those who have sometimes have suffered greatly for it. I mean, one of the great mystic al-Hallaj was burned at the stake for claiming Ana al-Haq, for claiming I am the true one, I am God. In the heights of their mystical experiences, they have claimed union with God, and one can understand that in light of this statement, I think, by the Bab, and in light of this metaphor of the universe being at its heart a state of awakening consciousness. Let me add one more passage from the Bab's writings that also, I think, link very well with this metaphor, and this can really open us up and challenge our thinking about what the nature of prayer is. Because if at the highest level, we are a fragment of the divine, and our will is nothing but a mode of the divine self-description, then what does it mean to pray to God? You know, praying to God assumes a kind of dualistic conception. You know, all of the prayers written in all of the, at least in all of the faith traditions in the Judeo-Christian lineage of which the Baha'i faith counts itself, positions God as the object of one's prayer and oneself as a supplicant, supplicating to a being that's fundamentally outside oneself. And that's perhaps the mode of relationship to the divine essence, which is the default mode, perhaps the mode which most people on the planet will relate to the divine. But Baha'u'llah also includes the possibility of this higher degree of and more subtilized degree of relationship to the divine, in which the lover and the beloved become one, in which the lover has unencumbered himself of his shirt and now has fully attained union with the beloved. In that sense, what is the meaning of prayer? And I think the Bab gives us a glimpse of what that can mean in this passage. And this is also translated by Nader Saidi in Gate of the Heart. And it's helpful to read the surrounding context that in this book. It's not an easy book to read, but I find that it's you won't come away unchanged if you invest the time in reading this book. The quotation by the Bab goes as follows: "At the level of the contingent world, true worship is realized for those who worship God through him and submerge themselves in the sea of absolute unity. For in that sea, the worshiper and the words of worship are annihilated, and thus there remaineth not for the worshiper but the very revelation of God and the pure countenance of the beloved. He who worshipeth God through anyone but him by gazing at his own self as the worshiper and at God as the object of his worship hath joined partners with God and hath never worshipped him." That's so challenging, because isn't that how all of us think of prayer? In a way, the Bab is, from the perspective of this station, saying you've never really worshipped God if you've worshipped God as the object of your worship. But how else can we do it? This is a very high standard that's been set forth for us, I think, here, is achieving a kind of mystical annihilation, so that the worshiper and the words of the worshiper are annihilated. But isn't this what Abdu'l-Baha says in this beautiful prayer? "Reveal then thyself, O Lord, by the merciful utterance and the mystery of thy divine being, that the holy ecstasy of prayer may fill our souls, a prayer that shall rise above words and letters and transcend the murmur of syllables and sounds, that all things may be merged into nothingness before the revelation of thy splendor." So this is a very poor attempt at trying to, I suppose, analyze the two different modalities of the spiritual life and of spiritual journey, and seeing both of these modalities, the modality of spiritual journey as a transformative moment or event, and the modality of spirituality and spiritual journey as an ascent through various and infinite stages, to see both of them through the lens of the circle of being as ways in which human consciousness ultimately moves from a state of self-centeredness to a state of other-centeredness, from a state in which one is defined and constrained within the ego boundaries of one's own self, and how one can, through the fullness of this journey, reach a point where those boundaries have entirely annihilated. And one can imagine that this has profound implications for the way we navigate in the world socially, and that's going to be the topic for tomorrow, is talking about implications of this narrative of consciousness for our collective spiritual reality, for how we see ourselves at identifying more in groups and identifying others as groups, and how we can transcend those self-identifications. Perhaps this is a good stopping point. I had a lot more material, but if there aren't immediate questions, I can move on to something which I might not have time to fit in tomorrow.
Stephen,
yes.
Can you provide some of the references for what you have put into the chat? Because the chat actually has a character limitation, which means after a certain amount of characters, it just doesn't convey the rest of the quote.
Oh no. So several of these quotes, it doesn't show it being clipped for me. Oh, there's one, I suppose, that did get clipped. I think all of the others came through.
Yeah, the first one from the Gate of the Heart, that
yes.
got clipped. Yeah,
that one did get clipped. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's and the
that's
other one, the one that if he is baptized with the Holy Spirit, that gets clipped at the Matrix.
That one can just is a quick Google search away.
Yeah.
This other one is let me pop that in. Let me just quickly suggest, and by sharing screen, I think, another way of navigating this question of spiritual progress, and that is that one can think of dividing our spirituality, both the purpose of spirituality as well as the day-to-day practice of virtue, about which I've said virtually nothing today, in relation to three different directions that one can turn. You can talk about our purpose, our spiritual purpose and activity in relation to God, in relation to our own selves, and in relation to others.
Stephen, may I just ask, when you share your screen, can you zoom in a bit? Because it's really small. It shows up really small here. I don't know how it is.
Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Okay. Here we go. And to talk about our spiritual orientation in relation to God, in relation to self, and in relation to others. I think Udo Schäfer does this in his 2-volume magnum opus, Baha'i Ethics. He also does this. It's very helpful because when one looks at the various writings about our spiritual purpose and spiritual prerequisites and what we're supposed to do in the world, it fairly cleanly separates into these three categories: our purpose in relation to God, in relation to ourself, and in relation to others. That can be further reduced really to two: because in relation to God and in relation to the self ends up being the same thing. Because at the highest level, when one is relating to one's true self, the worship of God is the worship of the divine, is the knowledge of that and recognition of that divine spark within. He who hath known himself hath known his Lord. But it's nevertheless helpful to divide it out into what our purpose is in relation to God, knowing God, attaining the presence of God, loving God, recipient of the bounties of God. And to talk also about the purpose of our life in relation to our own self. And I'm going to copy this into the chat window because when I close this. Knowing oneself, becoming spiritually transformed, developing our consciousness, and so forth. And then spirituality in relation to others, caring for an ever-advancing civilization, serving, living with others in unity, being a source of light and guidance in the world. So one can look at our spiritual purpose perhaps helpfully in this way. And then not just our purpose, but then the actual nuts and bolts of what to do. So the means of spiritual progress divided up into the same three categories. The path of search in relation to oneself, the condition of search, purity of heart, knowledge of self, sacrifice, prayer, all of these things go in that category. What we do in relation to God is receiving the grace of God, capacity from God, humility and meekness before God, and so forth. And then in relation to others. And here we have the golden rule and consorting with all others in a state of kindliness and fellowship, honesty and trustworthiness. All of these other-centered virtues can also be brought together. So this is another way of thinking about and studying this subject. And the Loom of Reality compilation has probably over 1,000 quotations just in those categories.
Stephen, you're welcome to go on a little bit since we started late. I'm sure that's okay. And but we're also, you can maybe continue maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can see if there's any questions then.
Sure, I'll go on another. The next topic is to continue our journey up the Arc of Ascent. So since we were looking mainly at the Arc of Descent yesterday, the kingdoms of existence, looking a little bit at, cosmology and things, from the highest level, planets and biological systems and so forth. And then today looking at degrees in the advance of human spirituality. The next highest level is that of the prophet. And we haven't talked about the prophet yet, the manifestation. What is the manifestation in relationship to this whole perspective, this idea of the circle of existence? The prophet, in one way, exists at the next higher degree along the Arc of Ascent, higher than any of us. For us, anything that exists at a farther along the Arc of Ascent than us is spirit, and anything behind us is matter, as we were talking about yesterday. And what happens at the levels beyond us is almost like magic in a way. The prophet acts through a degree of consciousness, which is higher than what we normal humans have. And so what they say and what they do, because we don't have that degree of consciousness, it seems like it's coming out of nowhere. It seems like, so we have this metaphor, and the metaphor is divine revelation. The metaphor is, it's like Moses went up to Mount Sinai, and there he received, literally from the top down, the revelation, which then became inscribed in the tablets, which were then brought down to the people. This idea, a very enduring idea of revelation, is as a top-down phenomenon, is naturally how we view it from our particular point along the circle of existence. But if you were to see things from the prophet's eyes, as Abdu'l-Baha gives us, I think, a glimpse of it in chapter 40 of Some Answered Questions, one has this is a very different narrative of what kind of a being the prophet is and what kind of knowledge the prophet has. And that different kind of narrative can be summed up in the following paragraph. And this is paragraph 8 in chapter 40 of Some Answered Questions. And actually, I should find it in Loom of Reality and then paste it into the chat again. So Abdu'l-Baha says, briefly, the universal manifestations of God are aware of the truths underlying the mysteries of all created things. And thus they found a religion that is based upon and consonant with the prevailing condition of humanity. For religion consists in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. If the manifestation of God, the divine lawgiver, were not informed of the realities of things, if he did not understand the necessary relationships deriving from these realities, he would assuredly be incapable of establishing a religion consonant with the needs and conditions of the time. And he goes on and gives the metaphor of the prophet as the divine physician. And he concludes this chapter saying, religion then consists in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. The universal manifestations of God, being aware of the mysteries of creation, are fully informed of these necessary relationships and establish them as the religion of God. This is a fundamental redefinition of religion. And it's fundamental because it sees religion not in top-down terms as something which is given from above, whispered by the angels or sent down, in an ray of light, but something which is ground up, something that is bottom up, something that is organic. Somehow the prophets are in possession of an understanding of interrelationships that far exceeds human comprehension. And it's that understanding of the interrelationships which comprises their special power. The superpower of the manifestation is they get things at a level no one else gets. They understand how it's all connected. And so they say what they say, and to us it seems like a top-down thing because we don't have that degree of consciousness. But to them, they're just describing things as they see them. They're just describing the relationships as they are apparent to them. It's a different kind of a narrative than the narrative of the messenger being simply a channel who's repeating words or repeating a message that was given to him. And again, it isn't a matter of saying one narrative is right and one narrative is wrong. One can continue to speak, within the narrative of prophets being given messages and conveying them on, because that's a true and correct narrative within its own perspective, within the perspective of, let's say, of the eye of distinction, perhaps. But the eye of unity sees the nature of the knowledge of the prophet as this kind of holistic understanding of things. And so they then are able to raise up human consciousness and bring human consciousness up further along the arc of descent because they themselves are higher along that arc. It begs the question, are there things that the prophet knows that they aren't telling us? The things that they could tell us, but then they're not telling us because it's not suitable to this state of understanding that we could know these things. And that is, since we're out of time, that's a really interesting topic, but maybe we can hold off on that for the start of tomorrow. Baha'u'llah has a lot to say about those things which cannot yet be spoken. And at which we can only guess at their nature.
Thank you so much. I can see that Nasreen has her hand up already. Nasreen, would you like to? Oh, and there's two more. Just a moment.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a seeker who does not believe in that we are in need of the manifestations of God. That, as you said, like as Cosmo is finding itself, or God says, "Kuntu kanzan makhfiyan," and due to that love, you can be known or get to your higher spiritual level by silent meditation. I just shared with him the example Abdul-Baha has given, but I don't know the source because it was when I was very young, and he was, one of the speakers at the time. And the example, I think, still applies, that Abdul-Baha has said, imagine a train going and you're sitting by your window, and what you see in that moment, imagine that that moment is a lifetime, for example. So what you see is very limited. But imagine someone on the top of the train that can look back, look to the right and to the left and in front. And the one up on the top of the train is telling you that, for example, in next minute, you are going to see a tree with this kind of characteristic, which at the time you can't see it because you're just looking through your window.
Mm-hmm.
And I said the manifestations of God are the ones on top of the train, which can tell us from the past and future and both sides. He liked the idea, but still, we are doing book one together. And when we go to the areas where, for example, Baha'u'llah says the soul of the believers after separation from the body is like encircled by the souls of the prophets and the chosen ones, and they share their stories. It's like, no, I cannot believe in that. And I say, well, these are just symbols that our souls don't have a shape. There is no gender. And of course, he has a very strong opposition to calling God him or he. And when I told him that in Farsi, we don't have gender in our, language, when we say oo, it can be a female, it can be a male. So he liked that. But still, he has those, and I don't know how I can, in a way, convince him that without the manifestations of God who bring this energy and release it for us, that's why our consciousness is kind of advancing, because of the energy that is released by this manifestation of God. He says, I have to think about it, but I don't know in which way we can tell them that just silent meditation is not enough to make your spirit advance.
Yeah. I love the metaphor of the train because it's not magic, the prophet is not a magical being. The prophet simply knows so much more, is so much more aware of things that to us it's like magic. We might as well call it magic. I mean, from one perspective, yes, it is, but from another perspective, it's simply an awareness of the essential relationships. My scientific mind likes that metaphor because I like ways of explaining and understanding these things that don't appeal to magical thinking, that are ways of understanding things more organically.
Thank you. Is Gisela next? Gisela?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, about the realms, or whatever you call it, above the human spirit, I thought there were other spirits in between before we came to the manifestation, like the spirit of faith and so on. Or am I mistaken?
I guess I skipped those. Well, in a way I skipped those, in another way I didn't. There's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he delineates, I think, 14 different degrees of spirit. And on the one end it's the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, the human, and then he delineates all these different degrees of human spirit from the base, it's called nafse lavame, I think, the self-accusing soul is how it's been translated, all the way up to the perfect soul, the soul of the kingdom, the solar dominion, and then you have the manifestation, and then you have, so at least in one place, Abdu'l-Baha has given, has filled out sort of quite a number of degrees. In a way, although I'm not sure what the mapping would be, these different valleys of the 7 valleys may map in part onto those degrees. But certainly the worlds of God are infinite, and the degrees of consciousness are infinite, and we can only ever touch upon a few and try in our faltering way to make sense of it.
Okay.
Harriet, did I see you raise a hand, or was that or otherwise it's Chris,
Me then?
Yep.
Okay. So sorry I came late. Sorry about that. But at the risk of going off on a tangent or maybe something that you've covered, where does Abdu'l-Baha fit into these kind of, we talk about the station of man and the station of the manifestation. Do we have any kind of knowledge or any writings on where Abdu'l-Baha fits into this whole scheme of things?
Well, we could just say Abdu'l-Baha said, Shoghi Effendi said he's the mystery of God, and we could stop there. Although Shoghi Effendi in the World Order Letters, there's a section in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah on Abdu'l-Baha, and there he positions Abdu'l-Baha very precisely for us. I should remember exactly how he did it, but he basically said the distance separating, Abdu'l-Baha from us, and he quantifies that difference versus the distance separating Abdu'l-Baha from, say, Baha'u'llah or the prophets, and he says one is vastly greater than the other. So if that's as precise of an answer as I know of off the top of my head. Certainly beyond us.
Thank you.
The next question is from Nasreen.
Sorry to take everybody's time, but the first day you were talking about the Jawahirul Asrar, and at the end Baha'u'llah says, by the time the person says like, I got it, then it goes back to the first step. And also now going through the 7 valleys, and what you said earlier, that we all have aha moments, but it's just a moment, a magical moment. So is that also where we say, okay, I got it, and we go back down again?
Yeah.
And I also know that these valleys are not permanent. Like I cannot say I'm in the Valley of Istiqlal, for example, and we kind of, because there is no place, there is no space, so it's all in the world of spirit. But this confuses me. Should I celebrate the moments I'm connected, or should I be afraid of it that I go back down?
That's such a good question. I mean, when Baha'u'llah describes this passage into the city of certitude, and at that hour will the mystic herald bringing the glad tidings, like, what are you supposed to think? Aren't you supposed to be happy? Isn't this supposed to be a wonderful moment? To what extent are we supposed to say, oh, no, but maybe I'm fooling myself? I don't know the answer to that. Does anybody else know the answer to that?
Thank you so much. It makes me happy.
Thank you. Robert, is it you next? Oh, you're just muted still. Hang on a second. Now you can speak.
Yeah. Hello, this is Robert. Thanks again, Stephen, for another wonderful lecture. Very fascinating and thought-provoking. I've got a question about the circle of existence. Is that the term you used?
Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone is on this circle and preferably on the ascendant direction. And my question is simply a very naive question, hopefully interesting. What the sort of primary essential motivation is for people to choose to be on this ascendant route. Could it be something like personal gratification to achieve a higher state of consciousness, or is there something that the founders of the Baha'i declared about that, about what the actual psychological motivation is?
That's a great question. And it connects to the earlier question, is this supposed to be enjoyable? Are we supposed to enjoy this, or are we supposed to always be second guessing, any progress we make? My guess is that anything that's aligned with reality is also going to be aligned with joy. I mean, in a deep sense, that that things are so designed that if we align ourselves with these spiritual currents that are in the universe, these currents that draw us back towards the source, then it not only brings us joy personally, but it also brings us into deeper relationship with others. So moving along the arc of descent, to use that metaphor, is closely aligned with a sense of personal fulfillment, as well as a sense of deeper connection and love and relationship to others. So in that sense, it's the incentive structure is there, to act in a way that fulfills the purpose of creation. In a way, I think the everything that I've said can probably be summarized in the idea that the purpose of the cosmos is realized through everyday acts of love. And things are designed in a way that when we perform those everyday acts of love, it becomes a self-reinforcing kind of loop. It brings us, it makes us even happier, and that brings us to expand our consciousness even further outwards. I don't know if that's a good answer, but
yeah, that was a very interesting answer. Thank you, Stephen.
The next question is from Parto.
Yes, thank you. Just a comment about teaching work, actually, though not directly related to the main topics, but this question of how to respond to seekers was brought up. I think it's important to address this. Of course, I cannot say I'm an expert in it in any way. None of us is, especially not in Europe. But the main thing that is in my mind is that I have found in my own experience is that explaining something to a person who is asking a question depends on the nature of, on the attitude by which that question is asked. If the question is asked genuinely in order to find out, the person's mind is perplexed and wants to find clarity, like the uncle of the Bab was perplexed with this issue of his nephew's station, and Baha'u'llah clarified it for him. In fact, his son actually first believed and then he believed. But anyway, so, but then if the question is that simply you don't like what you're hearing, and you just want to, I'm not saying the person is not a seeker, but is not in that sense genuinely in the process of search, but is reluctant or even opposed to getting something out of it, and then it is actually futile. Then it will lead to probably, even if you are not quarreling, it will lead to a situation which is similar to that kind of a setup. So of course, it's for each Baha'i teacher to figure out what is behind the mind and heart of that person, that seeker they are dealing with, and it's a very difficult task, because how can you know anybody's hearts? But we have asked to do that. Now, what I found is that instead of finding the people's questions, it would be much more useful to find people's yearnings. What is it that this person is yearning for? And for most people, it is the yearning for meaning. So often it's not these intellectual problems. it can be that too. I'm not saying it can't. It can be that too, but it's often a deeper sense of coherence. I mentioned that the other day, that at least among young people, they love coherence. They want to understand, wait a minute, the world actually makes sense. And because it makes sense, it's not hopeless, even in the middle of the mess. Even the mess makes sense because it's part of a transition and blah, 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 blah. So that kind of perspective on other human beings, even among Baha'is, it doesn't have to be a seeker, I find it's a very constructive approach, because then you are trying to relate and to speak to the yearning of the person, to address that, not the specific questions. Sometimes it takes in the form of intellectual things, and often it does, but sometimes it's other kind of things that bother you. How do I educate children? How do I save my marriage? How do I do this and that? So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, another way to maybe to put that point is that the teaching work needs to address every seeker from where they're at. I mean, it's an obvious sort of a thing, but the different question, I mean, different questions can have, the same question can have very different answers depending on who you're addressing. We can't think of there being a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to the teaching work. There can't be a single program or sequence or set of quotations or which can act as a universal doorway for every single person on the planet, that this is the doorway everyone is gonna respond to. We have to think about our teaching approaches in ways that are infinitely variable, because the kinds of minds are infinitely variable. And one of the things we're talking about, today is how you can have people genuinely seeking and in a completely different state of seeing the world. The eye of distinction versus the eye of unity, for example. The way you relate to someone who is seeing through one of these eyes versus the other is going to be completely different. And that's I think a real challenge that we have, because it's very easy. It's a lot easier to simply say, here is our one side, here's our one approach, here's the one thing that we're going to implement, and everyone is going to do it this way. I think what we'll find is that only a very small fraction of people are going to respond positively to any single specific, programmatic way of entering into the door of this most great revelation.
Thank you. It's Nasrin, and then after that, Fariba.
What Robert was saying, it brought the example we had yesterday. We are doing the new book 1 on Zoom. And so, being on the ascending arch of the existence, circle of existence, this example was given by one of the participants, which also includes what Parto was saying, that yearning. He said, if somebody is living in North Pole, they have all these heavy coats and, warm stuff. But if this person is all of a sudden in a desert, it necessitates it for him to take these jackets off, So it's the yearning. We get to the point that what we have is not enough. Mm-hmm. And that is when we start the search. I don't know if I was able to express myself or not, but that yearning is a necessity. As we go from one level of gray to another level and knowledge, the same in understanding of the spiritual realm and ascending circle. So that's what happens. There is a motivation that makes us want to go in a higher level. What we know is not enough. So that yearning, because now I'm in the desert and I'm hot. Okay, I take the extra jacket off. But if I am in a cold weather, I need to add to it. So it depends on where the person is, what state of progress or understanding the person is.
Thank you. Fariba?
Thank you. Gosh, I had so many thoughts. I was just trying to organize them. So I thought I would just make 3 points. And if you have any comments to any of them, that would be great. One was the point that you mentioned about the magic. Because of where the manifestations are in relation to us, we think that it's magic and that revelation comes to them by magic, whereas in fact it is organic, it's a bottom-up thing, they're aware of what's going on in the world. And I was thinking that, I don't know, just that we're seeing the process of revelation perhaps as magic, and that we're seeing as if the revelation is coming from the unknown to the manifestation, and as if we understand either of those two realms, whereas it is all above us. So if it was at all conceivable that the revelation was taking place from manifestation to manifestation, it's all within this middle realm that we were talking about, then it is simply above us. And yes, as you say, it's magic, but I think it's the way we conceive of revelation. So that's my first point. The second was this point about joy, you know, the point that Nasrin made, you know, if we have an aha moment or a eureka moment, spiritually speaking, you know, do we feel joy? And it brought to my mind a quote of Abdu'l-Baha, very, very, very simple. And it's some of the stuff that Abdu'l-Baha says, well, it's replete in our writings. They are just so simple, so fundamental, because they're the fundamental realities of existence. And I'm paraphrasing. He says something to the effect of, the spiritual world brings only joy. Sorrow comes from this world of matter. So the way I look at it in this narrative, the arc of descent brings only joy. So if we experience sorrow, it's because we're on the arc of descent, sorry. So that would be how I would see this narrative. And another metaphor narrative, well, I don't know how I would phrase it. Within this narrative construct, I wouldn't call it a dogma, but another construct that Abdu'l-Baha offers to us is that everything is constantly in a state of flux and change. Nothing is ever static. And so he says there's progression and retrogression, nothing remains static. And I was thinking again about this arc of descent and ascent with respect to this thing of nothing ever being static. If we are not on the arc of ascent, the chances are we're retrogressing. If we're not progressing, we're retrogressing. Again, within the same narrative structure. I think Abdu'l-Baha said something that fits very well within this. If you have any comments on any of those three, that would be great.
Oh, I don't think I can improve on them. Well stated.
Thank you. The next question or comment is from Grazia. Sweden.
Hi there. Hi.
Hi.
I don't know how to undo my hand up, but sorry.
Oh, I can do that. I can do that.
So it was just some thoughts. I had once read, it's not a Baha'i quote per se, that if someone was enlightened, they would find it too mundane a thing to state that they were enlightened. And so when we're talking about the state of descent and ascent and spiritual joy and attachment to that, I always fall back on the idea that this can become a attachment of sorts, a preoccupation, almost like a consumerist view. You know, you want more of that. You want to buy more of that joy, even if it's spiritual, even if it's an esoteric joy. And I sort of, in my mind, I see, rightly or wrongly so, and that's why I'm stating it so that I can understand it better, is when people are in sort of in a dark place and not following a spiritual path, let's say, or knowing what they're doing. It's a dark place, but they can be quite happy there. I know a multitude of people who are like, I'm really happy where I am in this bingeful life. And then there's the middle point of people where they're sort of awakened and they've had that aha moment and they want to progress and experience that joy and that passion. And then you've got people that are manifestations or something more advanced, let's say, where it's like that isn't even a process considered anymore. I mean, so is that wrong or right to consider it like that? I don't know. Those were just the way I started processing it.
Yeah.
I can't see you. There you are.
Yeah, getting into maybe we'll, since I have to, I have a hard cutoff at 12:30, but so maybe we could start the next session, take a little bit of time in the next session to go a little bit more into this internal state of the manifestation. Baha'u'llah lifts the veil a little bit at times. Do they exist in a state of joy or a state of pain and sorrow throughout most of their lives? You know, are they just wanting to say things that they can't say? I think about that a lot. And I have a few quotations and remarks on that, but let's hold off until tomorrow.